بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد سيد المرسلين وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. My dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum, may Allah's peace be upon you. Can everyone hear me? Yes. Great. Thank you very much. Thank you so much, my dear brother Dr. Bakr, for inviting me and for your marvelous and very passionate introduction about this project. And it's wonderful to see old friends. I remember our brother Hisham al-Talib when we both had white hair and more hair, and have many recollections of the time when my dad was then the director of Islamic Statehood in New York, and so the days have a way of rolling by. So please, for the young ones, take advantage of your young days, because you never know how many days we have. And to my brother Dr. Ebrahim Moosa, who is one of the pillars of modern Islamic thought, and who has impressed many people, and certainly has impressed me. And I remember approaching him some 12 years ago when I first conceived of this project, and he sent me some lovely articles of his about Islamic law and academic freedoms that we have that we don't have in the traditional Muslim world, and how creative Islamic thought and modern Islamic thought will be done more in the West and in places like IIIT, where the constraints on academic freedom are not as difficult. I hope I'm saying all the right things that you actually did say, right? I mean, we had marvelous times together. And to my dear brother, Dr. Jasser Auda, whom we've spent many a time in Malaysia and on this project. Let me backtrack and tell a little bit about how this whole thing got conceived. After 9/11, I was approached by many friends, mainly non-Muslim friends, to start an initiative and say we have to do something to improve this terrible relationship between the United States and the Muslim Ummah, the Muslim world. Many of my friends had traveled and been acquainted with the Muslims, the Muslim world, and they know that we Muslims are lovely people, decent people, and pious people, etc. So we thought about what needed to be done, and we founded something called the Cordoba Initiative, focusing on different areas where there is a difference of perception between the Muslim world and the West. We divide the problem areas into four broad areas: the perception, the media, the social identity problems, the strictly the political problems or geopolitical problems, which are really the drivers of the problems between the Muslim world and the West, and you might say, religious or theological problems. Now, one of the areas in which theology or jurisprudence and politics intersects is the difference in perception between the West and the Muslim world on what is called in the West separation of church and state. In the West, church and state is such a fundamental pillar of Western civilization that any proposal to not separate the two is conceived as an attack upon a fundamental pillar of Western civilization. In fact, when I speak to Muslim audiences, especially in the Muslim world, I say, just like we have the 5 pillars of our faith, if you reject one, you have rejected, you're a kafir. Well, if there's a Western religion, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, separation of church and state, these are among the fundamental pillars of Western secular religion. If you reject any one, you are a kafir in the Western existential view. They say, really? Wow. So the question is, but at the same time, in looking and reading the literature for the last century and before earlier, it is clear that this terminology, Islamic State or Dawla Islamiyya, this very terminology, is a relatively modern one. It began with the writings of Kamil al-Afghani and Rashid Rida and the Hassan al-Banna, Muslim Brotherhood. It came about when at the end of the what you might call the empire model of rule, where the rule was between a human being who ruled, the Sultan, the Khalifa, the Amir, the Nawab, and communities of people. I mean, the Ottomans, for example, formalized this. You had the Sultan and different millets, the different communities of people who were, as long as they paid obeisance pledged allegiance to the Sultan, they could live, they could even rule their communities according to their own, even had courts, separate courts for different communities. To the concept of a nation state. The concept of a nation state was a novel thing which began to be introduced into the Muslim world. And the modern nation state has created many problems for us. But as the modern nation states began to crystallize, they crystallize according to national identities. So instead of the Ottoman Sultan ruling over Turks and Arabs and Albanians and Azeris and Persians and Kurds and all kinds of different communities, all of whom had their millah status. Millah is an Arabic word. The Turks call it millet, if you may have seen this word in the Turkish way of looking at things, to a concept of a nation state. Once you had a nation state actually was the incorporation which developed after the Peace of Westphalia, and that both the American and French revolutions were instrumental in creating the idea of a republic. In fact, this notion was so modern that when King Louis XIV was approached and told that you are establishing a state, he says, "What do you mean by the state? Je suis l'État. I am the state. I, the king, am the state." But the notion, it was actually the introduction of what you might call the corporate idea. In a corporation, you have stockholders, and the stockholders vote for the president, you typically, and sometimes the officers, or unless the president appoints the officers, and you have to be a stockholder. So this idea of a corporation really is the idea of a republic, or a state. And in America, it was established on this basis, and to be a stockholder, you had to be a landholder, which is why in the original beginnings of the United States, only those who owned land would vote. You had to be a landowner because it was basically an application of the corporate concept. And those where they would vote, just like in a corporation, the stockholders would vote for the president, and in this situation, the president would then appoint the officers, the secretary, just like you have a president, a vice president, a secretary, and a treasurer. You have a president, a vice president, a secretary of state, right? You have the treasurer of the state, and then you appoint the other officers of the corporation. So that was the basic system. But in the problem that with one statehood is, well, who are the stakeholders of a state? Now, so what happened is that most of these concepts devolve the idea of those who are part of a state, or the stakeholders, the citizens, this new concept of a state, was basically based upon some kind of identity. It was identity based upon race, based upon religion, based upon language. So all of a sudden, Turkey, when it shifted from being an empire model to a state model, then you had to be Turkish. So if you're no longer Turkish, you didn't have the same white status as if you were Turkish. So the massive, just like what happened with India and Pakistan, the same thing happened in India and Pakistan. You had not as serious as in India and Pakistan, but you had massive migration between Greeks and Turks. So many of us may not know this, but parts of modern Turkey were majority Greek. Cappadocia, Smyrna, which is now Izmir, were actually Greek cities. In fact, Egypt, Alexandria, was a majority Greek city until the mid-1900s. And this is the seed of much of the problem. You still have vestiges of this problem in Cyprus between Turks and Greeks, and you still have manifestations of this problem of identity in many countries, like the situation between the Kurds and the Turks. So what has happened is that certain groups, like the Kurds, who had their own identity, had their own national identity, their own language, all of a sudden now had to have new identities. They had to be either Turkish, Iraqi, Syrian, Iranian, but they have a Kurdish identity. So these identity problems began to happen. But as these issues began to continue, there were those like Emil Al-Afghani says, no, we shouldn't have a Turkish or an Arabic nation state. We're all Muslims. We should have an Islamic nation state. It'll be interesting for you to observe that the idea of a religious nation state began not only for Islam, but also for Judaism. Around the same time, the 1800s, the discourse around a Jewish nation state and an Islamic nation state began. And it's interesting that the two nation states the Jewish nation state and the Muslim nation state were born practically simultaneously. Israel and Pakistan within a year of each other in 1948 and 1947. 47.
Yeah.
Anyhow, Israel was born in 1948 and Pakistan in 1947. But I mean, in historical terms, it's practically simultaneously that you see the birth of two states with a religious national identity. Now, this never happened in the history of Islam, nor in the history of Judaism. This concept of a religious nation state. However, if you look at the discourse since that time, there has been no real consensus on what an Islamic state means. Can you go to the slide on the different ways in which a nation state is defined? You have today when you say an Islamic state, it's used. The term is used in 2-3 different ways. One way in which it is used is the demographic. The demographic. You have to put the slides based upon knowing where I'm, because I'm going to be moving around.
Sure. It's on the notes for your slide.
Yeah,
right here.
but I don't know if you need to show
Right
it.
here.
But basically, the OIC definition of an Islamic state is a demographic definition. There are 57 countries which are members of the Organization of Islamic Conference, now changed to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and they're majority Muslim states. You have to be, with the exception of one or two, but the point is, there's no common definition of what it means other than the demographics. So you have secular states like Turkey and Indonesia. You have states like Malaysia that declare Islam as a state religion. There are those that don't. There are those that are monarchies, those that are republics. So there's no commonality other than demographics which defines that definition. Now, however, in every majority Muslim state, from Morocco to Indonesia, there are political parties whose aspiration is the establishment of something called an Islamic state, an Islamic republic. So we have now Islamic Republic of Pakistan, Islamic Republic of Iran. You have, I think, is it Maldives? The Maldives or Mauritius and the Maldives is an Islamic Republic. It's Islamic Republic of. So we have 3-4 countries which have the name Islam in their name. And then, so the question becomes, well, is there a coherent definition that we can come to do this? Now, as a physicist background as I have, one of the things that we know is that if you can't measure something, if you can't measure it, then it is meaningless. In fact, in physics, if you cannot measure something, it means it doesn't even exist, technically. You have to be able to measure, determine it, weigh it in some fashion or another to prove that it exists. So unless we can measure the concept of Islamic statehood, then it is meaningless. So that was the Holy Grail. How can we measure it? So I approached a number of scholars, beginning with Professor Ebrahim Moosa, people whom I knew, Professor Hashim Kamali, and said, we'd like to figure out a way to measure the meaning of statehood. So after trying to get funding for it, and for several years, from 2002 till about 2006, I approached a number of scholars until finally I was able to get support from the government of Malaysia to support this project. And I was invited to a conference where there was many professors of law. There were like 70 professors of law at this conference in the beginning of 2006. Hashim Kamali was there. Professor Mahmoud Ghazi, the late Mahmoud Ghazi, who was at that time the head of the International Islamic University in Islamabad. He had previously been the Minister of Awqaf of Pakistan and National Security Council, an incredible scholar. He was also on the Shariah Supreme Court of Pakistan. He happened to be there. The Tanab Hamid Muhammad, who just retired as Chief Justice, was then not yet Chief Justice of Malaysia, was at this conference. And we were having lunch together, and I said, we'd like to do such and such. And Professor Mahmoud Qazi suggested that, why don't you start? He said, if you have a conference of this many people, you'll never get anything. Everyone speaks for 5 minutes, the conference is over. So he recommended starting with a working group of scholars to define and agree on what an Islamic state means from the point of view of our jurisprudence, of our Sharia, in a way that also maintains the continuity of Islamic legal thought on the subject of the obligation between the ruler and the ruled. Is that a good mouthful? You got that one? Because that's the key thing.
That's right.
Okay? In other words, a working group of scholars to get some kind of ijma' among them on what this term Islamic State means from the point of view of our fiqh, of our jurisprudence, of our theology, to use Christian language, in a way that is not only consensus among the scholars, but also consensus between these scholars and all of the historical scholarship on the subject of the obligations between the ruler and the ruled. So that was what this project was about. And we tried to convene scholars, and then the political problems of this project were enormous. We invited, and the financial limitations. I mean, you have to deal with realities. Get a grant, and you want to get a grant, and say, well, if I invite for one scholar from the United States, I can invite 3 scholars from the region of Kuala Lumpur, because the airfare to come from New York and where to have it in the United States is very difficult. Not only is it more costly to fly people over there to come to but you can't get certain people here. To get a scholar from Iran to the United States is almost impossible, and it'll take a long time. Whereas from Malaysia, with the support of the government, it was easy getting scholars from the Muslim world. But they gave us a limited budget, so we tried to get as broad a consensus of scholars as possible. And the group of scholars is presented on one of the slides. We got people from Pakistan, from Malaysia. We had Jasser Auda, who represented Egypt, although at the time he was the head of the Maqasid Institute in London. Ahmed Abbadi from Morocco is head of the Rabatat al-Ulama al-Muhammadiyya, Secretary General of that group. Hashim Kamali is very well known to all as a great writer on Islamic law. Larijani, Dr. Larijani, who was recommended to me by, I had to approach ambassadors to try and get certain people. So I approached, at that time Javad Zarif was the ambassador in Iran, to the United Nations. He suggested Dr. Larijani, because we wanted a group of who would be willing to be part of a team of scholars who would not come and say, I'm the marja, you all have to listen to me, and I'm not going to reject. Because we have been to places where you have Yusuf Qaradawi and others, and Yusuf Qaradawi will not listen to anybody else. He'll pronounce, but some people have great difficulty being part of a debate. And we had, I tried to get Sam Al-Awwal, the ambassador of Egypt, said, I'll get him for you. He couldn't get him, in spite of many attempts. We had people who committed to come, and then the last minute they didn't come. So these are among the difficulties we faced in this project. So we got them together, and we said, okay, how do we go this? So first of all was trying to get agreement on what an Islamic state is. We discussed Sharia, what does Sharia mean, and we have a number of slides on that, and we've written about it in the first section of the book. So this book actually is a summary of what transpired and of the story. We had 7 meetings. They were closed meetings. We recorded the meetings with everyone's permission, and they said what they said. There was passionate disagreements, but very respectful, and on a number of issues, and nuancing of each other. It was a wonderful experience. I mean, I learned a tremendous amount. If you were to listen to the transcript, you would find me sometimes annoying, because I would deliberately be like what is it called, the sand in the oyster, which aggravates the oyster so that it will create the pearl.
Devil's advocate.
Devil's advocate.
a devil's advocate in a way, but I would try to scratch them to sort of get there. So sometimes it's quite deliberately irritating because I wanted to extract the juice from many of these scholars. But we did succeed in that, and then we culled it. We actually quoted some of the most exciting conversations and differences of opinion, and then we put it in the form of a book. Trying to get it published was so difficult, and it took 4 years for even Macmillan to get this thing from the very beginning until the end. Sure. So we begin with the Sharia part, where we discuss Sharia. We define the idea of Islamic State, and then we go to the measurement, and in the last section, part 3, is a group of papers or interviews, rather, which we put interview section and format about this project. So the word Sharia is from the word Shara or Shara, and it comes from a verse in the Quran where God says that He has ordained for you what He has recommended to Noah, and what's the Arabic one? And what we have commended to Abraham, to Jesus and Moses. So the idea is that that the Sharia is actually not something unique to Muslims. It is God's law which He commanded to all of humankind, and that the essence of Sharia is God's law and the eternal set of values that really define the relationship between God and mankind. The Sharia is defined as God's commandments, and the scholars agree it consists of what's called the Ayat al-Ahkam and the Hadith al-Ahkam, which means the commanding verses in the Quran and in the Hadith of the Prophet, where God says, you do this, He commands to do things, to do this and not to do that. And these commandments in total are what the Sharia is. And the fiqh of the Sharia is the human understanding of the Sharia, which also comes from a verse in the Quran, of verse 122 of Surah At-Tawbah, where Allah says, let there be a group of you, يَتَفَقَّهُ فِي الدِّينِ, to understand the deen, to have human understanding. So fiqh is the human understanding of the Sharia, and that is why we have madhahib of fiqh, not madhahib of Sharia. There's different ways of understanding God's law, or different interpretations of our human understanding of God's law, but God's law is considered as God's law. Right now, let's go to the definition of an Islamic state. A state is first defined, the scholars recognize that a state is defined by 3 major things. Its declarations, how it chooses and legitimizes, no, the previous slide, that Japanese, how it chooses and legitimizes its rulers, and the outcomes or deliverables it provides to its citizens. So in the United States, for example, we have the Declaration of Independence. It describes, what its worldview. It says that the purpose of that all human beings are equal, endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Because property first changed to pursuit of happiness. And to deliver life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, governments are instituted by men to achieve these objectives. When it doesn't achieve those objectives, then it's the right of the people to change the government, to get a government that gives them these deliverables. So the objective of a nation state is to provide these deliverables. So then, okay, what then would an Islamic state mean? As discussed by the scholars. Now, there were differences of opinion, and there were some moments where let's say on the issue of declarations, we had a point where people like from Pakistan and Malaysia said, no, there has to be a declaration. Those from Indonesia and Turkey, at that time Erdogan was not yet the prime minister, said no. The state is not a real human being. A state is not a being who will die, be resurrected, and judged on the day of judgment. There's no equivalent of the Shahada. Some scholar says just like a Muslim does the Shahada. When you're Shahada, you're a Muslim. Even if you don't pray, that is the minimum threshold to be recognized and accepted as a Muslim. There has to be a minimum threshold for a state. Those who argue that the state has to declare. Those who said no. A state is not a human being. A state's declaration is just a fiction. A state is a corporation. It's a fiction. It doesn't really say anything. The speech of a state is what it performs, what it does. Okay, just like, Allah's words are haqq, So the speech or the declaration of a state is not this declaration, it's what it gives and delivers to its people. That was the difference of opinion. Now, at one point, it reached a point where I said, we couldn't move on this. So what I did was I had just read a book a few months before called The Wisdom of Crowds, which is a wonderful book, which I recommend, in which he shows that if you can get the collective wisdom of a group of people on something, it is the truth. And he starts with an example which is fascinating of a sociologist a century ago who tried to disprove the importance of democracy. So he was at an agricultural farm, an agricultural show rather, where people were asked to guess. They saw a cow, they would take a guess after this cow was slaughtered and dressed, what it should weigh. And of course, the person who was the closest would get, the prize. You pay a penny each or something like that. So to disprove it, he got all the results of the people's guesses. He averaged them out. The actual weight of the cow was like 1,496 pounds. The collective mean, average of the mean, 1,495 pounds. Spot on. And he showed several other examples like this. And what I realized from this work is that this work provided scientific evidence, if you will, on why ijma' and consensus is a key aspect of Islamic law after the Quran and the Hadith. And the Prophet's Hadith where he says, my ummah will not yajtami'u on a falsehood. Okay? So this gave me the scientific evidence. So what I did was I proposed to them, since this is a live project, let us, we had those who said declarations are important, those who said qualifications of the rulers are important, and the legitimacy of the rulers is important, and those who said declarations are important. Let's give it a weight. So those of you who think declarations are important, how important is on a scale of 0 to 100%? Declarations is worth, let's say, 20%. Qualifications of rulers, 25 or 30%. And then the deliverables is 50%. Those of you who feel that deliverables is all that counts, give 0 to declarations, 0 to qualifications of the rulers, and 100% to that. And we would take the weighted average. They all agreed to that, and they were so delighted. In fact, Professor Ghazi, Mahmoud Ghazi said, I was so impressed by the application of mathematics to Islamic law. And with the notion that as we get a broader group of scholars, we can repeat the process again, and we can, take the average opinion. Because, opinions shift, people change their opinion. This is a way by which we could bridge this particular thing and continue on to move on with the subject matter. So this is what we did. But for the sake of completeness, we put everything that every scholar suggested had to be put in there to define an Islamic state. So we had a summary, and you can do that diagram up, of what an Islamic state is. They all agreed in some way or other, and in the ideal situation, that a state has to recognize divine sovereignty. Lillahi mulku samawati wal ard. There are many verses in the Quran which say, to Allah belongs the heavens and the earth. So God is the divine sovereign. But how is His sovereignty manifested on earth? So it's manifested on earth through two major legs, if you will. One is the collective vicegerency of the community. We're all khalifas of Allah. And the concept of the collective khilafah of the community, obtained through the consensus of the community after shura, which is consultation, and the ijma' of the community on a particular issue. In the case of ruler, when they vote and they agree that democracy is a way by which the ijma' of the community can be accessed or assessed to legitimize a particular ruler as being legitimate. The other way in which the divine sovereignty is manifested is through the supremacy of God's law, which is applied through two means. One, through the courts, that you have courts that apply God's law, the Sharia, to justice in the courts, and also the fulfillment of the Maqasid of the Sharia. Muslim scholars have agreed, because they sorted all the laws of Islam. Because Allah Himself, as Professor Hashim Kamali argues in his interview, is that Allah does not only command us to do things, but He commands us why He is commanding us to do things. He will tell us. For example, fasting is commanded, لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ. So taqwa is the reason why we are commanded to fast. This is why the Prophet also said there are many people who fast and gain nothing from their fast but hunger and thirst. Many people pray, their qiyam, get nothing from their prayers but fatigue, because there is a purpose and objective to these things. So based upon that, Muslim scholars from 1,000 years ago, discussed and wrote about the maqasid of objectives of God's commands, and they agreed that the overall maqsad, the overall objective of all of God's laws, of all of God's commandments, are maslahat al-ibad fi dunya wal akhirah, the interests of human beings in the dunya and in the hereafter, in the akhirah. And then they unpacked these into originally 5, and then Al-Qarafi added a 6th, which we included, which are the so-called 5 Maqasid al-Sharia, which are what? Which are the protection of life, of religion, of aql, of intellect, of property, of mal, of lineage, of nasl, and of dignity, the 6th, al-'ird or al-karama. And as Professor Jasser Auda said in his wonderful article, which has been an interview, it's not only the protection, but the theory of maqasid evolved, starting with protection of something to advancement of something. And some of the ideas of the maqasid themselves evolved. Nasl, for example, was lineage, but he quotes one of the scholars, Ibn Ashur, who expand the idea of hifz al-nafs, nasl, to be family values. So not only protection of wealth in terms of from theft or corruption, but also advancement of wealth. So promoting of the economy, giving loans to people, small business loans, to enrich the society. Not only to protect the aql from drugs and not consuming alcohol, but also educating people. So that's the advancement as well as the protection of these particular things. So we agreed that would be the definition of the maqasid, and the maqasid themselves have to be advanced both by the government as well as by society as a rule. So that was the definition of Islamic State that basically everybody accepted, and then we unpacked it into justice in the courts, social justice, economic justice, and so forth, and the Maqasid al-Sharia. So once we achieved ijma' on the definition, then we started the process of measurement. How do we measure this? Now this is where the challenge, the bigger challenge, really began. And the scholar said, you know what? The Sharia scholar says, well, this is our expertise. We agree with Sharia, but whatever you say regarding the measurements, okay, we will not be held accountable to that, because it was very politically dicey. I mean, even when I proposed to the scholars, okay, how are we going to, if you're going to create an index now, because the objective is to do an index. And for most of these scholars, the jurisprudence, well, for me was very interesting, and for most people I know is really informative. For them, you know what, this is stuff, we know all this stuff. That's nothing original over here. This stuff was written by Al-Mawardi and Ibn Taymiyyah. Justice is the most important thing, and for them, the theory of what makes a state Islamic was for them relatively nothing new. They were more excited about the achievement of measurement. But at the same time, when I probed them, says, okay, are you going to agree, if you talk about legitimacy, are you going to publicly say that King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia is more Islamic or more legitimate or less legitimate than King Abdullah of Jordan or Prime Minister Badawi of Malaysia? very difficult to publicly stand behind a position where you're starting to index. Salman now. Yeah, I'm talking about at that time. So the challenges were very difficult. So we agreed that we want this project to start taking root. And so we decided that we would publicly only announce statements about Muslim majority countries, the OIC countries, and that we would start, after we face difficulty trying to get measurements on each of these things, to start with the Maqasid. Let's do as a beta, as we say, as a beta concept or a beta product, or you have, 1.0 version. So we would say we would be starting with a Maqasid index. Now you all know what the Maqasid are, but then how do you measure it? To measure it, you need proxies. But when it's measuring life, what are you measuring in life? Are you measuring just, quality of life, how long people live? What are you measuring? So you need proxies to define the concept of life. If you are measuring religion, deen, what are you measuring? Number of people who attend the mosques, number of mosques per particular 1,000 people, how many people who attend Fridays? What do you mean by what are you going to measure? And that's when the challenges really began to hit. And of course, Jasser was a great proponent of this stuff at that moment. And then we had to collect data for it. So we started by defining a group of proxies, and then we had two options for data collection. We could either get data from polling, or by getting data which has been obtained by many organizations, like the United Nations, the World Bank, the CIA, World Book, and there are many sources of this nature that publish information. So after thinking about it and discussing it, we thought polling would be better. We approached Gallup. We decided to go with Gallup. I said, we do a world poll, we get information for many things. We can piggyback on their world poll, and we can do something for you. And we can allow you to ask 5 additional questions that match your proxies of the Maqasid al-Sharia to do that. After 9 months of working with them, they said, you know what, we can't stand behind this product. I said, why? After spending a lot and polling is not cheap, by the way. We can't stand behind it. I said, why? Because the concepts we're measuring after they do their statistical analysis did not cohere around a particular definition. Now, this was the beginning of my education in the application of statistical analysis to measuring of concepts. And what I learned from this, and this is how they taught me about it, if you know of a concept called heaviness, or hotness and coldness, or brightness and darkness, and you don't yet have a scales or a thermometer to measure temperature or whatever, and you want to create this thing, you have to first develop a measurement tool. And when you develop the measurement tool, what you're often doing is not only benchmarking the product in terms of are you measuring a kilogram or a gram, or you have to develop the criteria by which you measure. You also have to repeatedly measure to make sure it is valid. What you're measuring is valid. Because let's say temperature. When you have a thermometer, you're not measuring directly the temperature. What do you have is that, let's say in a typical thermometer, you have a liquid which expands and contracts. So you're measuring a correlation between the expansion of a liquid and the temperature. And you have to first create that thing. You have to test it to make sure what you're measuring is truly what you think you are measuring and not measuring something else. That's called validity. And you have to repeat the measurement. So let's say if you create a scale to measure how heavy you are, and today I'm 180 pounds, you have to repeatedly measure it to make sure it gives you the same measurement consistently.
Put on weight, brother.
If you put on weight, or if you amputated an arm, then that explains the reason, okay?
Took a kidney out.
Exactly, so then you have to explain it. Okay?
Reliability, yeah.
So that's called reliability. And they said to do this with us, they couldn't even quote us a price. It's prohibitively expensive. So we had to go back to stage one again. We finally found 2 professors who helped us. and they helped us to measure this. So can you get the slide on life or or aql? Maybe life. But I just very quickly, no, the one on the maqasid that unpacks the maqasid. Of mind. Go back to the life. Yeah, together. All right. So the scholars said this is how we define life. Life is the right to life and personal liberty, freedom from arrest, torture, etc. National security. National security is very, very important, and defense capability. Provision of food, shelter, and clothing to those who cannot afford them. Opportunities for work and employment. Health care, because health care is a way by which you measure life. And protection of the environment. Because if the environment is like you have smog like in Delhi right now or in Beijing, people suffer illnesses and they die from that. Or if the water is polluted, people get bilharzia in Egypt, and they get various diseases, and it affects life. So we got data from this, working with our two professors, and they realized that then there's something called factor analysis, okay, statistical analysis. And there are two things that they do, something called Cronbach's alpha and factor analysis, which is performed repeatedly to see if an idea coheres. And to explain this to the layperson, imagine if you are trying to measure something called, if you test a group of students on arithmetic, spelling, grammar, geometry, trigonometry, essay comprehension, you will find that the scores will cohere, the scores of spelling and comprehension and essay writing and grammar will cohere around one concept. And the scores on those who do well on arithmetic will do well, and there will be a correlation between arithmetic, geometry, trigonometry, algebra, etc. And you can realize, based upon statistical analysis, that there are two different concepts you're measuring, what we call in the SAT test the verbal score, or the verbal quality, and the mathematical quality. So they performed this statistical analysis, and what did they discover? Go back to the previous slide, please, Anna, on life. We found that the right to life did not cohere, and the opportunities for work employment did not cohere. We found that the right to life and personal liberty cohered with the concept of ard al-karama more than with life. That the opportunities for work and employment cohered more with the other definitions of the definition of the maqsad of property, not of life. Now, the same thing happened with the maqsad of mind. Originally, we had there the consumption of alcohol, because consumption of alcohol was deemed by the scholars the reason for the maqsad of aql. But when we looked at the statistical analysis, we found that the consumption of alcohol, because there are statistics available on consumption of alcohol per 1,000 people in different countries, it did not cohere with the rest of the definition of the maqsad of aql. But it cohered negatively with the maqsad of family and the maqsad of life. And these are the kinds of things which we discovered. Now we understood why Gallup couldn't stand behind it. So we provided this as a measure of Islamic State, and we tried to do that. Now, and what we have then is we did the scores for the Muslim majority countries, and we calibrated on a score of 0 to 1. We put them all on a common scale, and we had a first version. And you can run through very quickly and see what we did. This is our first beta version of Islamic State. Now, the maqsad of religion, we had one of the problems we faced was a lack of statistics, lack of data available to measure the concept of nesl. Nesl actually means what? That you are actually the child of your own parents, not from somebody else's parents. Okay, that you are the purity of lineage. There's no statistics available on purity of lineage. We don't collect this information. And it's very difficult. It's difficult to obtain this kind of information. So how do you index the maqsad of nesl? On religion, also, we had difficulty getting data. So we took the data from one of the sources, and it's basically about religious freedom and those 4 bullets that you see over there. And the number 1 country turned out to be Senegal. Notice very interestingly that the majority of those that scored the top 15 of this particular set of definition of Maqsad of religion were mainly African countries. Let's run through the rest of life. You'll see that the top countries are very much the small oil countries: Brunei, Qatar, UAE, Kuwait, Maldives, Malaysia. Let's go to the next quickly. Maqsad of family, again, we had very difficult data here. Mainly these countries, we were indexing marriage more than anything else. And in countries where women marry early, we score very highly. This is what that one came out. The maqsad of mind, these were the things. We had to drop off the consumption of alcohol into this concept. These were the definitions that the scholars suggested. Again, you'll see a correlation between mind and life and property, that the top countries tend to be the same countries: UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Malaysia, Brunei, etc. And property, you'll see similarly on this one. Now, the more important thing is, what did we learn from this? What we learned from this, and there are areas for further research. One, of course, very obviously, we need more data. We need more people to get more data. We need to get more reliable data that matches it. Can you, the next slide, is there? And there are areas of research which, I'm sorry?
Challenge.
The challenges were lack of data, the inability to obtain data for certain proxies. One important thing which we found was the different values embedded in statistics. For example, if you look at the idea of when you were trying to measure property, for example, or employment of people, in certain cultures which are poor, which are mainly agricultural, during the time of reaping and sowing, everybody in the family is working. So in some cultures that would be considered a plus, whereas in other cultures that would be considered child labor, the Western culture. So the scholars came to realize that in many of the data we were getting, that cultural values very often, even when you don't think it is very much involved in your evaluation. And certain values like marriage, for example, or how do you measure family values? Okay, that family values are very culture specific, extremely culture specific. And so if you try to index countries which have different valuations or different cultural values on whether a girl should be married the moment she reaches puberty, or she has to get an education first and get married, very often make it very difficult to index countries. Another factor of difficulty we had was that the data was old, pre-Arab Spring. And because we had to rely not on polling but on these publicly available things, that some of the sources of our data for this particular first version of the index would be unacceptable to many Muslim majority nations. I have another slide on areas of potential research, and this is where I think I'd like to share this also, particularly with this particular group. That the ability to get more data is one thing.
I mean, it's in your notes here.
It's in my notes? Okay.
Just right at the bottom there.
No, this is.
No, not this. One of the things that needs to be done is in the definition of the Maqasid itself, the relationship between measurement and actually refining the Maqsad. For example, if there is no correlation between the consumption of alcohol and our measurement of aql, to me this meant that the definitions, the proxies that the scholars are providing, were not measuring the aql which would be impacted by the consumption of alcohol. Now, when the Quran says أَفَلَا يَعْقِلُونَ, is it talking about the ability to perform mathematical operations? Is it talking about the aql of research and development for building an aeroplane? What is the aql? Just as we said that you can cohere the scores on aql, mathematics and verbal separately, is there another concept of aql? Another concept that we are trying to measure that perhaps the proxies that the scholars suggested did not actually reach. That's one of the things that came apart from this kind of research. The other kind of thing is the measuring the evolution in the maqasid. So if nasl is very clearly defined, we couldn't get data on it. But how do you find family values? If Ibn Ashur says now the maqsad of aql now evolves to include the family values, this is a separate ideational context in the maqsad itself. So perhaps there's a separate measurement for family values as a measurement for nasl. So in the evolution of the theory of the maqasid, the attempts to measure made it clearer, at least to me, that there is further research need to be done in the definition and the theory of maqasid itself. So these are a couple of things that I realized in terms of the need for more research. So also the next steps that we hope to attain is to have more scholars participate in this at all levels, to critique it, to add to it, and to build upon this. So thank you for your time, and I hope I didn't.
Well, jazakallah khair, Allah barakallahu feek.
Thank you, sir.